So we all start this filmmaking journey somewhere. I want to share to you guys some of the filmmaking mistakes I made when I first started out on this journey, and hopefully it'll help you avoid making some of these silly mistakes. The first thing I would recommend is shoot in 24 frames per second. It's going to give you the most cinematic and pleasing look. 30 frames per second, it looks like you're shooting, well, it kind of looks like you're on the news or something. And then 60 frames per second, I'd save all that for like gaming videos and stuff like that. But if you're trying to get cinematic looking footage, the most appealing to the eye, I would recommend 24 frames per second. Now, the only time I would ever shoot in 60 frames per second is if I'm trying to get some slow motion footage. A lot of our cameras don't have 120 frames, which is like the typical slow-mo setting. So a lot of us use 60 frames per second for that slow motion setting. So keep that in mind. If you do want to get slow-mo, shoot it in 60 frames per second and then slow it down 40%. So that's gonna make it slow motion in a 24 frames per second timeline. And the next big thing I would recommend is when you start out, you'll get into color grading. The biggest mistake I did when I was color grading is I'd oversaturate the image. I would make my skin tones look way too orange. The greens are just popping, and it's just, sure, it looks good when you first start out. You're like, oh wow, look at all the vibrant colors. But if we're going for that cinematic look, it's actually better to almost desaturate your image slightly to keep the colors more natural, because our eyes can pick up on skin tones, grass, and the blue sky. If those colors are off, then our eyes can pick up on that, and it takes away from that cinematic feeling. Now, color grading is no easy task. It's still something I'm still trying to learn. That's something that you just have to do. Keep making videos and keep color correcting, because that's like a never-ending process of learning. I'm starting to get moderately decent at it, but it's taken me quite a while. And even still, I'll look back on a video and I was like, something about those colors don't look right. But yeah, just remind yourself, next time you're color grading, try not to crank the saturation up too high. So the next big mistake would be not using an external microphone or a shotgun mic. The onboard audio from most cameras just doesn't sound that good, and you don't have a little dead cat to protect you from the wind. It's actually quite windy right now. You might be able to hear a little bit of it, but if I were to take this off, you would actually hear what it sounds like. Here, let me do that real quick. Okay, so hopefully this represents how the wind sounds without the dead cat. Is that what it's called? It's kind of a weird name for this. Okay, I just watched that last clip over. The wind was horrible. Now, there's plenty of cheap microphones out there that are actually pretty good. Right now, I'm just using the Rode Video Micro for my setup right now, and works great for me. I mean, yeah, of course, there's more expensive mics that probably sound a little bit better, but any mic sounds better than no mic. All right, guys, we'll hop in the office for the rest of this video. Let's go. All right, let me just throw you on here. Still addicted to these fizz waters. Okay, so the next beginner's mistake would be using the auto settings in your camera. Now, I know it's easy when you first get a camera just to switch in auto, hit the record button, and you're off to the races. But if you're trying to get the most cinematic footage out of your camera, it's so important to use manual. And it's actually a lot easier than you think. There's only really the ISO that you need to change, and if you're changing the frames per second, then you change your shutter speed to double that. The next thing I had no knowledge of when I began this filmmaking journey was ND filters and how important they are. Most of you probably already know what an ND filter is, but if you do not, allow me to enlighten you. Essentially, I'm going to use the most thrown around analogy there is. They are sunglasses for your lens. And what it's going to do is it's going to be able to keep your aperture double your frame rate, so you don't have to keep cranking your aperture And what it does is it allows the motion blur to look the most natural. So it's not gonna look all skippy and look all weird. The eye can pick up on those kind of things. And it's gonna allow you to have more of that bokeh. I'll never know how to say that. Overall, it's gonna make your stuff look more cinematic, and it's a must-have. Okay, and the next mistake I have made was cranking my ISO way too high. I recommend finding the native ISO for your camera individually. Mine for the Canon EOS R is 400, so I try to keep it around 400. Now, I'll crank the shutter up if I need to in low light situations, but I won't really go over 1600. That's about the max that I'll go, because it starts introducing a lot of grain and just the image starts falling apart. And ultimately, when you're shooting, you want to just try to find the most light you can to keep the ISO nice and low. For example, let me just crank my ISO way up. Okay, so this is the highest ISO on the camera. And that brings me to my next point. Use proper lighting. Now, you don't have to go out and buy really expensive light. You can use natural sunlight to your advantage. Go by a window, or if you're outside, use natural light to your advantage. But let's say if you want to make a studio setup, invest in some lights. There's a lot of cheap lights out there that you can invest in, and it's gonna up your image so much. It's gonna make your stuff look way better. Let me turn off my light and turn on this horrible tungsten light above me. Okay, so having that light on, I would have to just crank the shutter up. Or sorry, the ISO. No go. All right, guys, I'm gonna wrap this video up here now. Hopefully, if you're a beginner, these tips will help supercharge your progress in your filmmaking career, because it kind of sucks when you start out and you don't really know what you're doing. So go ahead and go out there and shoot. That's the most important thing, is just getting out there and shooting, because you truly learn from experience more so than somebody telling you what to do. So go make those videos. And if this did help you, consider hitting that like button and subscribing, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. All right, guys, peace.